Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great CAAMFest so far. As Sapana said, I'm Tran Nguyen. I'm the director or co-director of MOTHERLOAD, and I'm excited to be in conversation with our panelists today around the theme of 50 years after the fall of Saigon. So it'll be something that's quite reoccurring, and I'm excited for you to engage with us on this storytelling journey. So I'm going to introduce the filmmakers up to actually introduce their shorts. So we'll start with Quyên Nguyen-Le, who is the director of Thread. Come on.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm a little taller. Well, I'm going to do another intro. So the series itself is produced in collaboration with CIRAC, the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, based in Washington, D.C., but also has a branch here in California. So joining us are the team from CIRAC, so Executive Director Nguyen Dinh, Elaine Sanchez-Wilson, and Mandy Dieck. And so this is a series of films that were produced by a small team and all kind of commemorating 50 years since 1975, which was a year that was the so-called end of the Vietnam War, the end of the secret war in Laos, and also the beginning of the Cambodian genocide in Cambodia. So a lot of things happening that created a massive move of displacement of Southeast Asians. And so this series is really about that. And so I just wanted to kind of introduce our series. And joining us too, sorry, I'm doing a lot of shout outs. We have our whole team, not our whole team, but a lot of our team here, in addition to the other directors who will introduce themselves. So I have my co-producer, Nancy Nguyen here, who's also the editor of Threads. We have Ace Wang, who is the editor of The Market. We have our digital intermediate team, Thumb, who's AKA our colorist, and our SF-based post-sound team, Leon and Matt. I'm not sure if they're in the room somewhere. Okay. So my episode takes place in Greensboro, North Carolina, or North Carolina largely. About the Montagnard Dega community and kind of how they've been building generational memory since the end of the war. As indigenous ethnic minorities in Vietnam, their story is not often told within the kind of broader discourse of the Vietnam War. So that's all I'll say now. We'll show a couple of clips, and yeah, starting with this one called Threads. Thank you.
The majority of Montagnard tribes, before reading and writing, would pass down history through stories and art. So much of our history has already been lost due to colonization and imperialism. The word Montagnard itself is a French word that means mountain people. Weaving is something a lot of young people aren't doing. It just seems like something only the elders do. Naturally, I feel like it's my responsibility to take it on as an art form too. It feels like I'm holding on to the rarest treasure in the whole entire world.
So next we have TEB CHAW, or Land, by Joua Lee Grande. And I'm going to have Joua come up and introduce Land.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to repeat the name because we use a consonant that a lot of people don't use. It's called TEB CHAW, Land. So my piece really focuses on Hmong farmers based in Minnesota in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis metro area, and nearby rural areas. And it really focuses on Hmong elders especially and their love for farming, their relationship to soil and its healing aspect, and also the ways that the Hmong community has really transformed and even saved a lot of the food waste systems in Minnesota. So, thanks.
cho nó mà dân nó phải trả lời cho hàng thế nào để nó ngó cho nó chỉ solo yếu rồi na đây bộ cho solo yếu đó 10 11 19
This is my Dutch.
no more dark
What do you want to do? What do you want to do?
no
That one?
more dark good play for you
I look forward to coming here every Saturday morning, get some fresh callaloo. I love callaloo. I grew up eating this in Jamaica, so I can't get these anywhere else. Yeah, I've searched a lot and all over for this kind of veggies. I can only get it, seasonally here, and I get it at the farmers market right here in Brooklyn Center.
like 10 bottle I give 150
And lastly, The Market by Oanh-Nhi Nguyen. And I'm going to have Oanh-Nhi come up and introduce The Market.
Hi everyone, Oanh-Nhi Nguyen. Had the privilege of directing The Market, which is about how these really resilient Southeast Asian refugees, Laotian, Cambodian, Vietnamese, started an incredible market in Philadelphia. So huge shout out to Philly.
He started selling at the other side, the original side, back in 1998.
Vì sao mà người ta được dừng lụa những cái lụa tới bộ chi rồi riêng dương của nó rốt tới rồi nó chỉ món đinh dương món đó nè rốt nè.
Because at the time, they weren't, they didn't have a permit to sell. So it was like ticket for selling?
Yeah, selling and you're not supposed to sell.
Yeah.
And we throw everything in a truck, a van or truck. I have a truck, I just throw everything. When pick up, it's hard. But when the ranger come, you have, I don't know where the energy come. You just pick and throw.
sometimes they will sit behind me I don't see them and my son mommy we I said what we he said police I said okay we'll run
แล้วก็ไปซื้อใหม่เองกันเห็นหมู่มาขายก็ขายน้ำกันเองก็ซื้อใหม่เองก็หลายเทื่อ
And every time we came back, it got bigger, right? So I always compare it to daisies, right? Like you rip some up and more come show up.
Thank you for sharing a little sneak preview of your shorts in your program block. I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow, Saturday at 2 p.m., Kabuki 8, 2:30, at Kabuki 8, you can catch all 3 docs directed by these fabulous filmmakers. So please grab your tickets now for it, so you're in for a treat. So before we begin, I just kind of want to thank everyone for being here, and of course ADOCS for planning this really thoughtful event. And kind of to give a little context, I guess it might not be relevant in our case, but maybe just to put it out there, very few Americans are educated about the impetus for the American war in Vietnam in general. So far fewer know about the shadow war that was being fought alongside it, right? Very specifically, I'm talking about the secret war of Laos. And I want to thank you all for offering a perspective of what gets lost, yet what persists. And I really kind of want to spend this time to talk about your approach to centering underwritten histories. And very specifically, personal history and public memory, right? So to begin, I kind of want to talk about the process of making, nonfiction, right? So nonfiction is explicitly tied with its code of ethics. So to care for those who hold stories and to toe the line, like I said, between personal history and public memory. So can you each kind of talk about your process and really walk us through your initial research phase, right? Kind of unearthing something that is so maybe even purposefully mistold. So talk about your kind of research process, your introductory to it, and perhaps even community outreach, right? Because it so lovingly ties all of these really wonderful nuances, right, of these communities that go kind of uncovered in a way, right? So maybe we can start the conversation there. Any particular order?
Can you turn it on for me? Okay. I think I'll start by kind of talking about a question I am thinking about a lot now, which is like half a century since the end of a war and the beginning of a genocide. Why is it important to look back? And I think when I talk about the American perspective, it's like inclusive of people of color in the US too, but the American perspective has been like explored, whether it's the anti-war movement, the experiences of veterans of color. And I think largely when people say there's an exclusion of quote unquote the Vietnamese side, there's also a kind of collapse of what that means and like the diversity of how that affected people and continues to affect people. So I think there's this perspective that I think I face a lot where it's the kind of feeling toward it is that everything that needs to be said has already been said, and the only thing that we as like, I'm second gen, I was born in the US, that we're left with is that we have to learn that history instead of being active participants of like framing and understanding that history. So I think that's kind of, so I think of commemoration continuously as like a process of like learning about ourselves. I think that's kind of like always my approach to filmmaking. So it's not trying to make a 19-hour series about what happened in the war, why did the US lose, like where did we go wrong military-wise. Those things I think are important to a certain degree to understand what happened on a micro, like a macro scale. But I think what gets lost is like what you were saying beautifully, like these little things that get lost along the way, and a lot of the times those affect women, mothers, people who are like quote unquote civilians who are not in the military, but even for people who fought in the military, there are like small things that get lost, and I think that's what was really beautiful about working on this series is being attentive to the small story and how this bigger history affected those folks, but not necessarily trying to like bulldoze over like, we are the ones that are the authority and you have to listen to us. And like, we're the most important point of view. But instead like offering for our community, like a conversation with each other.
Thank you for that. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think when it comes to research, at least for this piece, research was just my lived experience and my knowledge of my community, and that a lot of Hmong people, young Hmong people who grew up here, most people's parents farmed and gardened, whether it was to sell at the market or just for their own families so that they could save some cash for other expenses. And so when I was working on this project, it was really great because I already had a lot of knowledge about things that were going on with the community, things that would not be found by any newspaper or research paper. It's knowledge held by the community. And the woman you all saw in the clip is actually my mom, who has been farming like in the community garden while she was working. And then when she retired, she didn't retire. She decided, I'm going to start growing to sell at the market. And so there were, just through her experiences, I got to observe things that were really beautiful, like, for example, the fact that it's Hmong farmers who are not only introducing like foods from, like vegetables from Asia, but also because there's been, in the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a lot of African immigrants coming to the Twin Cities, and the Hmong farmers are the ones who are growing the things that they want to eat and they had at home. And I found that so beautiful and fascinating, and something that I don't think a lot of people pay attention to. And then I also think a lot about, I did a little stint in mainstream journalism, and the thing that I struggled with was who we determined to be reliable sources. And oftentimes in the mainstream, the people who are determined to be reliable are not people who look like us, right? It's people outside of our communities who are experts on us. And so a lot of my work is just believing what these communities share as the truth, and that is the research, and that's part of what goes into it, so yeah.
Thank you, Joua. Thanks.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. Like first about the approach. It's interesting because I've been making docs and films since I was 13, 15. Took a 10-year break. But it's the same stories. I'm now 34, about to be a mom. So it's just insane to think that like the stories I tell when I was young are still the stories I tell today. So it's less about an approach, but it's something I feel so deeply and things I want to uncover for myself or for my family. And I just found out that my great-grandpa and great-grandma were separated right before the war. And there's a lot of separation in my ancestry, actually. And I think for me as an artist, I think I'm just trying to put the puzzles together and like understand it for my own. And then the second thing is for the market, I had the privilege of, before the market, taking root with my fam right there, Landon, who's the co-director of Viet Lead. And Take Your Root, because of Viet Lead's amazing work, community work, we made like a 3-episode series about how Southeast Asians resettled in Philadelphia. And because of Viet Lead and Lan's work, basically, of having these relationships built for 15 years, folks were eager to talk to us about their experiences, not just Viet folks, Cambodian, Laotians. And when Nguyen invited me to do the market, I partnered again with someone I met through Taking Root, Katsi, who's in the episode. So yeah, it's all community and relationship based, and it's all like these relationships that people have built for many, many years. So,
yeah, thank you for that. You know, and this is something that I'm hearing like a central thread between the three, like between our conversation thus far, is like thinking about empirical knowledge, right? Like who gets to hold this type of knowledge? And really like more meaningfully, when you look at the archives or when you look at these histories, it renders our people into civilians, right? As opposed to what we really are, right? We have these like small, valuable, nuanced lives that can't be accounted in these ways in which like this empirical knowledge wants to account for. And I think what's so beautiful and lovely about a lot of your documentaries is that there's actually a really limited relationship with like the archive. It's actually a lot of personal archives, right? Like some like beautiful family photos and ways in which you're kind of like embroiling this like personal history. Can you talk a little bit about kind of approaching or kind of towing the line of how to kind of make new archives, make new memories essentially, right? This is like what you're doing in a way, like you're kind of ambassadors of this, hopefully this thing that I think generationally we're really excited for is to make new ways of remembering the past. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some of those strategies? And then, you know, and this can just be a natural progression. I really am so curious about the questions that you ask, you know, like the folks that you're interviewing, because it's really stunning. Sometimes I'm really emotional by it, by like one question kind of uncovers this like whole life that we don't know. Right? Like sometimes it's just like a question between us and this like kind of greater unknown or the things in which we hold dear. So maybe start with like talking about kind of archives into maybe ways in which we kind of open up these personal archives.
Okay, I can start. I'm actually working on a short right now that's requiring a lot of archives. It's about the Hmong community's impact on Minnesota as a whole. And it's exactly like you shared. A lot of what's in the archives are personal videos. Thankfully, in the Twin Cities, we have the largest Hmong community in the US and one of the largest in the world. And so we have a lot of organizations doing amazing work for the Hmong community, both locally and globally. And we have what's called the Hmong Archives, just a small group that's slowly been collecting things. And a lot of it has just been photos and videos that people have donated, and I'm like looking through this, I'm like, who are these people? They're gonna be in the doc, you know, surprise. But also like, I found videos of myself. I found a video of my dad in there, which was like, oh, cool. And then I also find that I end up reaching back into my own personal family archives. Whenever I'm interviewing people, I ask if they happen to have videos or photos that we can utilize and things like that, because there aren't other resources. There are, of course, like sometimes you can find news articles or video reports here or there, but it's sparing. And yeah, I don't know, I can't remember if I...
Oh, questions. So what were the kind of questions that you asked, like in your like interviewees?
Yeah, so I find that a lot of, especially, there are a lot of people that I work with who, as soon as I have a camera in front of them and I ask them some questions, it just comes out. And sometimes they're the ones guiding the questions because, of course, we all know, those of us who are doc filmmakers, you go in with an idea and sometimes you find a different story. And so I very much go in with certain questions, but allow my participants to also offer whatever knowledge or information they'd like to, and then sometimes I follow that lead. And then, especially with a lot of our elders, a lot of them have never had the chance to share their stories, so they're actually, whether or not they even realize it, really hungry to share their stories. So sometimes if you put a camera in front of you, just ask a few questions, it's like a flood of information and things that, like we talked about this recently, like things that they have never told their own children, and for whatever reason, there's a block there where they don't feel like they can, but to a stranger, it like all comes out. And so in my Fuller film, we have Tim, who's an elder farmer and who was a veteran of the Secret War as well, recruited by the CIA to support American soldiers. And I had asked him something so simple, which was, did you farm back in Laos? And suddenly there was like all this whole story about him being a soldier at the age of 14, and all these other things just came pouring out. And so yeah, I find that sometimes you just let people talk and share the things they want to.
Yeah, I also had that experience with the market. There was one of the vendors, I think it was the first time she ever shared her story, and just everything came out. And some of it was pretty traumatic stuff. So I think as a person, asking the questions, holding the space, is understanding how vulnerable it is to be able to have this conversation. There's a reason why I'm behind the camera. So just allowing and giving them space and telling them, if you want to say something again, you can say it again. If you want to take a break, you can take a break. But also I think it's really important to be trauma-informed as a director, to understand the questions you're posing, being patient, and also when at that moment she just wanted to, just talk about her experience, which was pretty traumatic, just letting her talk about it. And I felt like a kind of a duty just to let her say what she wants to say, let her guide the conversation, and pivot when it needed to be. But I think it's also a gift to be able to have that together. So yeah, I very relate to what you shared, but that, making space for the vulnerability and not taking that space for granted.
I have a kind of shifting relationship with what I call the archive. The Vietnam War was at one point the most documented war in US history, so much on TV. And what I always tell other filmmakers is that, I feel really angry when we have to pay for archival footage of the US bombing our homeland, and that's still an issue. But at the same time, also the US military, you can use their footage in your films because it kind of belongs to the public in a way. But those archives don't, of course, as you're saying, kind of show the daily life. It's always aerial, machine guns, and and so I used to avoid them altogether. But now I'm trying to sort of find the moments within them. And as we're getting deeper and deeper into the archives, and Nancy, our co-producer, was amazing in finding all of these things from organizations, the IRS, International Rescue, Red Cross. The Red Cross has a lot. And sometimes, again, it's just them helping the people, but sometimes they turn the camera, or as we get more, I guess, fluent in who has what footage, I think there's a way that we can edit and stitch together a kind of feeling of life that is so precious because it doesn't exist in the personal archives, like the hometown of someone who hasn't been back since he left in the 1970s. Finding footage of that within a government archive is precious. And the way that we present it, maybe we take out the annoying American announcer voice, and we, and we just have the image of like the children running in the village and things like that. So trying to think of like ways to use the archive differently, because I think, so much does get lost in the passage, and so much is like in people's memories that I used to take it for granted that a lot of older Viet people would watch these terrible movies about the Vietnam War because they were looking at the scenery. Like they were like, I'm just like not even looking at the people, like the fighting. They're like, hey, look, it's Vietnam, but it's actually the Philippines, but it's supposed to be Vietnam. And so I'm really leaning into that logic of like, there's a nostalgia for seeing things and kind of putting a visual to the memory that people are kind of like feel very isolated and alone with. So that's what we try to use in our film, is to kind of like remix what exists, but have them be the narrators instead of like what was originally in the archive be the narrator. And I wanted to highlight in Oanh-Nhi's film the incredible work of the personal archives, like so many of the vendors, the photographs, that they had, that kind of gives like the longevity of the market.
Also, shout out to Katsy, who went to everyone's house, vendors, to get the photos. So again, that's also how we were able to get those.
Oh, and questions for me. I had a unique position because I'm not from North Carolina and I'm not Montagnard. And we have 2 of 3 shared languages among me and the participants. So I speak Viet. Some of them speak Viet. I don't speak Bunong, which was the main language that was shared among all 3 participants. And then, of course, we had English. So I think, in a way, like navigating the 3 languages kind of triangulated a story. And where I felt like there was a gap, I leaned on the participants and I asked them to just actually talk to each other. I would like sort of facilitate the conversation, like, oh, do you want to talk about this? And, if it was in English, I would understand. If it's in Viet, maybe one person would understand and I would understand. And if it was in Bunong, I would totally not know what's happening. And I just, and I think people talking to each other is a good strategy when you yourself have limits as to like how to facilitate, or you can facilitate the conversation but not be the interviewer.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm so glad, Wayne, that you brought up, this is something that we've talked about individually, but maybe this might tie into, oftentimes when we look at these like films about the American War in Vietnam or, popular war films, a lot of our family members watch it and they watch it to see Vietnam or they watch it to see kind of the greenery and ignore everything else, right? Like ignore the fact that they're like soldiers or maybe these like misrepresentations. They're just kind of excited or feel nostalgia for like the lush green of like home, right? And I think like nostalgia is kind of summoned in a lot of your work. So can you talk a little bit maybe about that, or if it's not fitting, maybe this is like a question I think it's like often asked of the audience, but maybe talk about your like introduction to it, like so why the Philly market, right? And like why the Hmong community, right, in North Carolina, and also like like why like the Midwest, and so maybe we can play with either ideas.
So like I shared earlier, why Philly? I used to live in Philly, and I was good friends with Nancy Nguyen, who was the co-director at Viet Lead. And like we've been friends now for like almost 10 years, and I wanted to get back into filmmaking, had moved away from Philly, and then Lam was doing research on how Southeast Asian refugees resettled in Philly. And that's kind of how that started and why Philly for me. And then Nguyen called me up and was like, hey, I want to direct an episode on Philly. I was like, oh, yeah. Like, first of all, that's so generous of you. I never got to thank you. I'm going to do it publicly. because you know, being like a director, especially emerging director, is already difficult, and then finding somebody who's also a director who wants to hire you for something is very generous. So I just want to thank you for seeing me and for wanting to highlight Philly again. Yeah, so that's why Philly for me. But the market does represent a lot of nostalgia for sure. It was started in the 1980s. Folks were selling, you know, herbs, and they were getting raided, and they were like at a park, still getting raided, and they kept coming back, like you saw in the clip. And so the market's still there now officially, and the people, one woman I interviewed, her mom made this amazing papaya salad, and she's continuing her legacy making papaya salad. And Katsu, who's in one of the interviewees in the market, still talks about that papaya salad, you know? So it's like very much like intergenerational, the market, and nostalgia is really the core of the market. And it's just incredible what they've been able to build and heal as a community without any support. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to interject and say, like, these two were like some of the first people I thought about collaborating with. When Sira came to me with the project, I think immediately I was thinking, this is a project that, of course, the films have to be made, and there's like calculations about like who to bring on, who has the technical skills, can we work with this budget, but also kind of like assembling a team of talented people and kind of thinking of it intentionally as an opportunity to like build. And so both Joua and Oanh-Nhi, like, to me, this is not their first film about Southeast Asian refugees, and that was important to me because I wanted to bring people who kind of already thought deeply about these topics, that even though it might be an intro for the audience into these topics, that it's not an intro for you both because you've had bodies of work that kind of already explored these topics. And so often, just like very explicitly, I think women and queer people are very undervalued as directors. They try to kind of like push us into like producer, like kind of like run behind the scenes, but you don't have the kind of like respect as the vision that kind of runs the show. So I thought it was important to intentionally kind of bring those views to the forefront, both of you as directors, but also in the team. Sorry, that was kind of a tangent from what you were asking, but I wanted to say that because I think in a kind of environment where apparently we're afraid of DEI, it's like people bring things to the table that are not always kind of like clear on the resume, but they bring a wealth of knowledge, as Joua was saying. Like she knew how to make this film in a way that I don't think other people would have. But could people have seen that based on like the way that we're evaluated as filmmakers? And so I feel like really like fired up about that. And you know, and nothing's perfect. It's like a puzzle piece, right, of like schedules and who's free and geographically, like, does it work to have this person or that person? But yeah, I think as Southeast Asian American filmmakers, I think a lot has been said about like the war and us, maybe like a whole body of work, but how much of it is made by us, and not just kind of like intro level. Like, I think this is like not grad class, but it's not like the GE maybe.
How dare you? It is a grad class.
Yeah, it's like a little like in the middle, like you're a sophomore.
No, it's definitely grad level. It's grad level. But you know, as a professor, I would say so. But you know, I think that the thing that's really exciting is that's exactly that, right? It's you know, oftentimes, this is not a foreign idea to any of us, but it's quite patronizing to be told your own history in this like really uninteresting, diluted way. And so it's really like thoughtful and careful, like, you know, like actually like full of care, how you approach this like storytelling and how it puzzles together to think about not only is this like super misrepresented like capitalist project of like the Vietnam War movie, but really what it purposefully erases, what it purposefully like leaves out, right? And it's a strategy. And I really like that instead of maybe pointing out this like strategy and saying that this is some type of like counterinsurgents, right? You are just actually capturing and caring for these lives and stories that exist. And we are not exactly a strategy. And I think that that's really important to like underline. So I think it's so important and really exciting that it gets to be taken care of and lived, right, by people that really deeply engage with the community. Yeah, so thank you for that. Joua.
Yeah, I want to say thank you too for bringing me on.
It's a fan club up here.
Yeah, you're extra special, and still hoping that you move to Minnesota. Anyway, yeah. So in terms of like the Midwest, we have so many rich stories. I think a lot of people think of the Midwest and they think it's just super white, and folks think about Minnesota, Minneapolis, they think it's super white. It's actually Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities. We have one of the biggest communities of like refugees and immigrants. And so we have a thriving community, a very diverse community. Of course, yeah, if you drive like 30 minutes outside of cities, it gets very white. But, you know, like the cities itself is really rich. And I see so many stories. Whenever I'm out meeting other people, they're like, oh, would you move to LA or New York to do film? And I was like, why? There are so many stories where I am. Like, I just need the support to tell these stories. So why would I go out there just so I could come back here to tell the story and then go back? Like, it doesn't make sense. So there are just so many amazing stories that for me, I think it's really important then to uplift the stories that are in the Midwest and also the filmmakers who are in the Midwest. And I think typically when I go to events like this, I'm like the only Minnesotan there, or if there are other Minnesotans, they're like, oh yeah, I grew up there, but then I've lived elsewhere for like 15 years or whatever it might be. I think this, at CAAMFest this year, this is the first time that we have like a posse of Minnesotans, which I was like very excited about. So it's just beautiful to see those stories be supported and come to light. And yeah, so I think it's like so important because there's so many stories that are missed when we're just looking to the coast. And also so much context that you're missing when you're sending someone from the coast to the Midwest to tell these stories. Because like for example, when I was first reached out to work on this project, like Wayne did not know that my mom was a farmer. So in our conversation, I was like, oh yeah. And I started chatting about like farming stuff. Like I was like, oh yeah, I already know about all this. And so there are things that of course you can't find through research and only community knows. And so I think it's been really great to be able to work on this project with people who have ties to the communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's so much like lively embodied knowledge that's being represented, and I think often that's, you know, the thing that we talk about, or the thing that we go back into, like with this kind of troubled relationship with the archive, is that for the most part we kind of see it as this disembodied thing in many ways. So, you know, the way that, Joua, you were talking about like the land and farming to be kind of so secondary that like, you know, when one of your interviewees like retired, he went back into farming because it was kind of a homing in a way, right? Like a rehoming in a way of this like second part of his life, which I think is a really, which I think is like a really interesting perspective, right? That's a quite nuanced perspective that like one misses if we were to kind of like look at like the coastal existence of like diasporic realities. We kind of miss a lot of what's perhaps, like as we understand the kind of refugee crisis and why people were brought to the Midwest or why people were brought to different parts of the US, a lot of that kind of gets like erased, right? And so maybe that's something that I want to ask very specifically about yours was, and you started to talk about it. The thing that I'm so curious about is obviously there's not a plethora of representation about like Asian or diasporic realities in the Midwest. But maybe just in short, can you kind of express or talk about what about the Midwest, right? Like what about this like particular community that you feel particularly drawn to or in your representation of it, right? Like kind of talk a little bit more about that. A little Midwest love.
All right. Well, I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, so I think there's a personal tie, and I also spent like 10 plus years in nonprofits, so I'm very connected to the community already, and I already know so many of the stories that none of us see our stories in the mainstream, and we'd love to. And even seeing something very small, like a short film, and having that experience there, like we screened my piece just briefly, our pieces briefly at an event, and having someone in the crowd be like, oh, my mom's a farmer too, and also having other work that I've done where people are like, oh my gosh, that's the first time I've seen myself on camera or on screen. And our communities are very unique, and it takes a lot to understand. Like, some people have heard of Minnesota Nice, and it's difficult to navigate for many people, but as a Minnesotan, I'm like, I've got it down. So, and there's just so many great stories, and I think going back to also what you mentioned about the farmers, so we featured 3 farmers. There's my mom, Ka, there's an elder farmer, Tim, and then there's a younger farmer, Jansen. And Tim's story is very unique. It's something you were talking about earlier, where when he revealed that he was a child soldier, because I already know the history and the complexities of all that, then I could really shape how to share that story in a way that could speak to the community there, and also really highlight those things even subtly for a wider audience.
Yeah, and to kind of, so the question was like a little bit about kind of this regional specificity, and for you, I mean, the market is like so Rust Belt, right? And because it's in Philly, and the Rust Belt is kind of like defined as, this like collapse, like this kind of capital collapse, and yet it's now kind of actually defined by like the migrant communities that come there to build anew, right? And so maybe a little bit about that, and then also, yours is about the regional South, and like diasporic realities, queer diasporic realities in the regional South, which again are like largely, vastly underwritten representations, right, of diasporic realities. So maybe, again, a little more regional love.
I want to say, I guess, like, I'll connect it all. I'm still thinking about what to say regionally, but I think something that I'm thinking about a lot is like conversations within our community. Like, when people say who's the audience, I think sometimes it feels like when we say it's like for us, sometimes people feel like, oh, but don't you want to talk to other people as well? And I think it is that. Sometimes when people talk to each other, you can learn a lot by listening to the conversation, even if they're not talking directly to you. And I think I'm leaning into that a lot in the documentary practice. So these films, early on, we were talking about how do we make these films in a way that like our communities or people who have been in the work, who have been in the community or even experienced these things aren't like, yeah, I already know. Why are you like saying the same thing I already know? And then even though it might be new to outside people, that there is something that we're giving to our own audience too, whether that's regionally or within our own ethnic communities or like a broader Southeast Asian refugee community. I think, so I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm very much like LA, people are like, LA, Hollywood, film, and so, I'm West Coast, California, film capital person, and to sort of make a film in North Carolina with a community that I've only known through organizing, so like activism work, but not personally, is a process of like understanding those limits and where like things fascinate me, like how in North Carolina the lights are like on a string. I don't know if y'all are from the South. That really fascinated me, and people were like, why do you keep filming those traffic lights? But I just thought like, oh, yeah, they dangle. I'm like, dang. It feels precarious. Yeah, exactly. It does feel scary. But I think like sometimes when you're an outsider, because you can never be fully an insider, there's always something that kind of puts you outside. So myself, I think a lot about being queer and kind of approaching culture from that lens, and always knowing that there are certain people who are considered like the ones who are in, and there are certain people who are like, oh, queerness is outside of our culture because it's Americanized or westernized or whatever. That's a whole thing, but I just kind of thinking about an outsider perspective in a way that's not like written with guilt, but also like responsible to like how there are limits, I guess, is like what I'm always trying to pay attention to. So as a person who's not from the South, who's not from North Carolina, who's not Montagnard, I think I really try to lean into that, and that's, you know, not try to dominate the way that the story is told or be a little bit self-reflexive. And whether or not that's enough, I think that's just a question, right? Because I hope that my film is not the only film, you know, that is a part of a larger conversation, and, you know, to also kind of like limit the self-importance of one's film, because, you know, it like takes so much effort. It took over my life from last August to now. You know, like I just been thinking about this film series, and it feels like it's the whole world, and you're trying to convince people to, you know, put resources into it. So it feels like the film is so important, but then in the grand scheme of things, the film is a tool that the community can use for something, and that's, I don't know, I guess like humbling for me to like not both take it seriously, but not be like too like in my head about what it does.
Yeah, I relate a lot to what you said about outsider. So I was born in France, and I grew up there till I was 6. So I'm Vietnamese French, and then I moved to America, Vietnamese French American. And that was very confusing. It took me, you know, I even like language, thinking about how I used to be fluent in Vietnamese, then I learned French, then I learned English, and like what I lost. And I think moving and, like I said, separation, my family, my great-grandparents being separated, my parents being separated, it's like it's a lot of moving around in my ancestry, and I think in my own life too, of not trying to find home for myself, thinking, you know, I'm Vietnamese French, you know, I'm Vietnamese American, I don't know. So for me, Philly, so when I came to America, I heard a lot about how, you know, a lot of Viet folks were resettled in California, and I was in New York, like outside the city, and I was not around a lot of Viet folks. And it wasn't until my 20s I started to find that community again. And I felt like it was interesting that the narrative about Vietnamese folks was primarily focused on like the OC, which is great. But also I felt really grateful to partner with Lan and Viet Lee to really tell stories of Philly specifically, because I don't really think you hear about Southeast Asians in Philadelphia, and how, you know, the resettlement system really failed us in America in general, but Philly specifically had a very specific narrative and very specific experiences, how Southeast Asians were really just dropped in the 1980s, and communities already struggling with Black communities. There were like Black folks living in an apartment building that was, you know, awfully like dilapidated. They closed them down, kicked them out, and then the refugees were just resettled in there. And so there's like a lot of tension between Asian and Black communities, but also how little support folks had. And I don't think that's a narrative that we hear often. And so I'm glad that Philly is showcased again, because I don't think that's told enough. So.
Teamwork. I think there's like a really beautiful thread, right, between like this type of like regional, like, you know, you're kind of like foreign and an outsider to the region, but also by thinking about kind of operating as an outsider, how that can, some of those strategies can like parallel or lend to how you approach like filmmaking and maybe like closer to the questions that you have. And same for you as well, you know, and then this obviously like insider embodied knowledge, right? So there's this like really beautiful dynamic array of storytelling that's happening here. And so I want to thank you so much for this conversation, but what I want to do is open up the conversation to Q&A, and this is the portion of the talk in which Van does all of her cardio for the day. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will hustle over to get a mic to you. Don't be shy. I'm a teacher, so I can stare you down until a question appears. Yes, also, thank you, Sapana. No takers? We could also keep talking. I mean, this is...
I could add on to what we were
Yes,
talking
that'd be
about.
great.
Yeah, I think there's like a beauty in having a balance of people on a team who are from the community and people who are outside, because you sort of need both perspectives to be able to, like, you don't need both perspectives to tell an effective story, but it does help. Like, I think about the feature I've been working on for forever, and my first editor is a good friend and is Hmong, and so our first, like, assembly really got to the heart of the Hmong experience. And then when I brought on my new editor, who is not Hmong, who doesn't have a relationship with the Hmong community, but who is Korean and has the Asian experience, then she could come on with sort of like a little bit more detached and see it in a different way and see things that maybe we miss because we're so close to the community. And so there's a beauty in having a mix of that.
And I want to say a piece about language because it's really important to me as someone who was born in the US and not as around Viet people growing up. I think in the diaspora, we have like our trauma and emotional baggage around being ripped from our mother tongue. And I think a lot of that kind of like healing needs to happen. And so I think in this series, we tried a lot to get the intergenerational stories through language. So whether us ourselves were speaking it or somebody else, and kind of just intentionally having, especially elders, not speaking English. They could if they wanted to, because I think a lot of people might be like, no, I can speak English. And it's like, no, it's not because we think you can't. But sometimes things are expressed differently. Like people have different personalities in different languages. And so I think building a team around language access allows us to understand stories deeper. And that's like my own journey as a diasporic Vietnamese person, trying to get more fluent and sort of like acknowledge how hard it is to not know the language and all the feelings that come up when other people are more fluent than you and you're like, oh my God, like I feel sort of like I'm not fully expressing myself, but kind of like going on that journey and trying to have that present in the films. I think there's just so much we lose when we lose our language that I thought that was an important piece to our films too, about the piece around like language and which language is being spoken on camera.
Yes, okay, we have a question. I'm coming.
As a diasporic filmmakers, when you think about roots, because it's our roots, right? So when you think about roots, what comes to your mind? What do you think that, what does roots mean to you?
I've been thinking about this a lot this past year, and that like, I think so much of Southeast Asian American identities, and definitely Hmong identity, is so tied to war. Like so much of our roots are in war when that's not really who we are, that's just our experiences. And unfortunately, what we've had to deal with as things have happened around us with people in power. And so I think a lot about like looking beyond that and not. So I actually like struggle a lot whenever I do films about Hmong people for a wider audience, because then I'm always encouraged to include the war. I'm like, but we are not the war. I just want to see a film where we're not talking about the war. Like, I understand we need that context, but like, we're not just the war. We have other things. And so I think a lot about like reaching out past the secret war and all the experiences that the Hmong have had that have been erased historically by people in power, and the knowledge that we hold in our identities. Because it's very hard to describe who we are. Some people are like, oh, Hmong people must be nomads. I'm like, no, it's taken me a long time to even figure out like how to describe it, and I describe it as we were an indigenous people who've been repeatedly displaced over thousands of years, and so we don't have a homeland. necessarily. We're spread all over, right? Spread all over southern China, Southeast Asia, and then because of the Secret War, now all over the world. And trying to understand who we were before all of those conflicts, like not even just the Southeast Asian wars, but even the conflicts before that.
Yeah, it's a good question because, well, I want to highlight CRAC's campaign for this year, so which is called Our Roots, Our Power, and it's, meant a campaign that has many components, and this is maybe a soft place to land in terms of like the narrative and the reflective piece of a larger movement to build power, Southeast Asian power nationally. But yeah, I think a lot about culture. I guess like very explicitly roots, I'm thinking plants as a metaphor, and like what happens when people are uprooted and then put into another land, right? But something else I think about, like especially as a queer person who, like I feel like bloodlines and kinship get kind of severed, or like you're kind of like written out of the family bloodline in so many ways. About how culture is passed, especially for me being born in the US. I think a lot of people think of the culture as passed through your parents, and then it comes to you and you pass it on to your children. And something that I found very like freeing is finding your roots elsewhere, or like grafting your own genealogy of like where you come from. And I think that largely I learned from the activists in my life, of like understanding that you don't have to, you have a choice in what you inherit. And sometimes you don't, generational trauma, you're like, oh my God, I don't want to inherit it. Like, can I like push it, right? But that we can graft our own future and what we're inheriting from our own culture. And I think I think that's what the roots are. Like the roots isn't necessarily like the tree from which you came, but maybe like the way that you want to look at yourself and your history and where you come from, like that's something of power. And I think when I was younger, I thought of that as something that limited me, like that having certain roots or not sharing politics with my family or not understanding why certain people did this, and having the kind of family trauma that so many of us have when we're from refugee communities that have war in our families, is kind of like, I guess, thinking of roots differently. So I'm struggling with it because I'm thinking of the plant root and I'm trying to have like a metaphor, but I really do, I don't know, it's like you're like a mad scientist and you're like, but I want to be a broccolini, not not just a broccoli or a Chinese broccoli.
How about rot? Like, I think that's like the other thing that I'm really interested in is like diasporic failure, like how failure is kind of deeply absurd and really interesting, and it kind of parallels with our diasporic reality that like is sometimes more absurd than it is, or even more funny than it is like tragic or full of trauma. And so Oanh-Nhi, maybe you could bring us on home. And sorry,
I'll try my best. I mean, when you asked the question, I immediately thought of my grandma's, my great-grandma, I don't know why. I think it's just like I said earlier, the reason why I make films or I say the same stories I have told is because I feel it's so really rooted in my soul and my spirit that I have to tell these stories. So I think about my great-grandma who, had 7 kids, like when she was separated from my grandpa, had 7 kids to herself, had to run 2 businesses and very savvy. I think about my other grandma who left my grandpa because he was cheating on her, but she left him with 5 kids, and like that's like the 50s. So I think about them, I think about their strength, and I think about their power, how they just kept going, and just how, I take that with me, and I think of my mom because she told me stories about my grandma a lot growing up, and it was specifically not about her trauma, but specifically about her strength. So that's what I think about.
Thank you so much for engaging with us today, and please check out tomorrow 2:30 the program block for Our Roots, Our Power, and I'm so excited to have spent this time with you, and I know this is just the beginning of a really thoughtful conversations ahead. So thank you everyone.